Hello, everyone. Welcome on the barricades. My name is Boyan Stanislavski, and this is another edition of our show. So, today we're diving into the absolute cringe fest that American politics have turned into. The so called greatest democracy and guardian of the free world is now offering us a mad race between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, both of whom obviously completely inadequate to navigate the complexities of today's international situation. But here we are, witnessing this nonsensical spectacle unfold before our very eyes. So, to help me make sense of this situation, I invited Derek Monroe. Derek is an independent American journalist and an occasional collaborator with various American, Asian, and European media outlets. His views often go against the accepted mainstream, which I suppose shouldn't be a surprise to our regular viewers. That's the typical profile of our guests here. I want to tell you also that I first came across Derek through his observations and comments and opinions about Eastern Europe on social media. I found his analysis very interesting, and that subsequently led me to invite him on our show, and I'm thrilled he agreed. And we discussed American politics, what they have become, this cringe fest, as I said. We're trying to unpack the underlying problems with the United States and its political process. And we dived into how it can be explained to someone who's outside America. I recorded this conversation with Derek earlier, so let's see it now. Hello, Derek. Thank you for coming on our show. And let's dive straight into this rather problematic phenomenon, which can be described as American political process, I guess, in most general terms. And I want to ask questions from my natural, so to say, perspective. That is a perspective of an Eastern European. And myself, like many other Eastern Europeans, regardless of where they position themselves on the political spectrum, we perceive the American political process as extremely chaotic, violent, inconsistent, with decisions that don't really make sense, at least from this outside Eastern European perspective. So, how about we start with you explain us how the structure of the U.S. government, along with the influence of what some refer to as deep state or permanent bureaucracy or double government. How does this contribute to this situation, and obviously how it shapes in a way that it produces this confused perception?
I think, first of all, we have to look at the structure of our government, which is made of three branches: executive, judicial, and legislative. And executive, legislative, and judicial. And that's what is being called in the civics in our country, where we have three branches of government, each is supposedly independent of each other, and they're making decisions. And there's a system of check and balances, which means each individual branch should not take precedent over the other. However, in reality, I think the best way to understand the U.S. foreign policy, as well as the internal and international politics that affect our country, it's probably been described by Professor Michael J. Glennon in his seminal work in 2014 that came out, which is called The National Security and the Double Government, which is a very good explanation of our what's can be called perennially called deep state. Exactly, that doesn't matter who's in charge, doesn't matter which party is in charge. The international policy prerogatives never really change. There's basic continuity of the I would say imperial government policy, which tends to cross pollinate a variety of different politics, not only externally of the United States, but also internally. And I think also one thing that a lot of European viewers might not understand about our politics is that if you look at individuals, specifically which are involved in formulating either domestic or international policies, they usually come from very small political cliques, where at the end of the day, the way our system works, all politics are local, which means someone who comes from, let's say, internal political procedures and environment in California, Illinois, where I live, New York, and where else, is eventually going to graduate for different of the U.S. government, if he's a professional government employee, into a sphere of politics, which are going to prejudge and also preform the outside world. Therefore, our imperial way of looking at things is pretty much very much colored by individual experiences of people who come from each American individual locales, whether it's Texas, what is California, what is Illinois, New York, what have you. So this is the first thing, which I think people have to kind of understand why there's some kind of degree of chaos in our policy making processes, decisions which are actually making, which looking from in hindsight or from commonsensical standpoint of view, do not make a lot of sense.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about various corporate interests that influence the executive and the legislative branches of the US government. And of course, I don't need you to explain to our viewers how industries like oil or military industrial complex influence or shape US foreign policy. But I think it would be interesting if you could explain to us how do elements of those interests lead to contradictory positions within not only the same political class, but within sometimes the same administration. I think a very good case of that is the Ukraine Russia war. So, how does this dynamic of corporate interests uh, contribute to the perception of what some people refer to as the uniparty, where major policies, especially when it comes to foreign policy, they remain consistent, and that's completely regardless of which party is in power.
But also, if you look at our political structure, especially when it comes to executive and its legislative branch of the government, you see a lot of different competing corporate interests, which actually buy our political class with a variety of different agendas and interests, which those interests themselves wind up competing. For example, oil industry has certain different agenda that they want to have implemented, and this translates itself into a foreign policy being focused on Middle East. However, we have a manufacturing sector or a sector which is basically becomes sort of like, let's say, uh, arms manufacturing or retail, what have you, which are very much interested in areas where we could export our weapons, because the only manufacturing sector we have now left in the country is pretty much all with military industrial complex of any significance, to be honest. So the reason we have parents in our use foreign policy is within the United States, within often the same political party, whether it's a Republican or Democrat. And these are the people, for example, who are formulating the policy and often giving our, let's say, uh, political class or even our diplomatic corps, like let's say United Department of State, often conflicting agendas and conflicting orders in order to get things done. So a lot of times you see major upheaval in very contradictory positions within one administration. And I think the best example of this is the situation with Ukraine and Russia right now, where there are some competing factions which actually want the war in the Ukraine being concluded as soon as possible, to a degree the Ukrainians lose as little. But on the other hand, you have a push from military industrial complex that wants to have a never-ending war. There are more weapons can be sold, and and it's just sort of like a self perpetuated cycle of violence and business that's kind of continuing forever. So this is exactly what's really kind of taking place right now within our country, and the fact that majority of our political class is paid and bought and paid for, it doesn't really matter where there's a Democratic Republican administration at the helm. Basically, I called it the uniparty. Basically, kind of when it comes to major prerogatives of foreign policy, let's say vis-a-vis Europe, Asia, or Ukraine, Russia situation, the things are, they're pretty much in agreement to kind of continue the situation as much as possible for our own profit.
Yeah, okay, so I get that, but still, I think it's important to that you elaborate on this a little bit because many Eastern Europeans, I suppose not only Eastern Europeans, people from outside the US, they find the political landscape there and the political process confusing, perplexing. And I guess especially when it comes to the general public trying to consider the influence of corporate interests and oligarchic control in America. So yeah, so let's have you elaborate on how special interests through think tanks, through lobbying, through media ownership shape both, I would say, domestic and foreign policy in the United States. And additionally, uh, how does this influence or how does it contribute to the superficiality of the political discourse, which focuses so much on this cheap emotional appeal rather than anything substantive? And I think that can be seen in examples like immigration reform proposals from, for example, Donald Trump.
Well, our political and economic landscape is very pragmatic to the point where, yes, there's a degree of ideology that's coloring the viewpoint of things in life, including foreign policy. But think tanks are themselves extensions of those special interests because the special interests fund the think tanks. So, in a way, if you're a political donor that wants to have some kind of, let's say, influence on a certain aspect of the American domestic or foreign policy, the best way to do it would be through lobbyists, which actually wind up lobbying our legislative and executive class directly, or for the think tank by creating some kind of degrees about what's being perceived as a problem and what's being perceived as a solution. So there's basically two channels which take place as in formulating foreign and domestic policy, and whoever is able to put more money is be very vocal about issues that are supposed to affect all of us Americans in this country, whether using media for that purpose, because media is basically also all paid for, and you really have a sort of like a pizza delivery type of situation where you order a pizza of certain political topping and you basically get a half an hour later either delivered to you or pick it up. Media basically is basically a tool of this. So any kind of presumption of the American media independence is absolutely false. They're basically they're also part of the appendages of the corporate interests which actually fund them, and a lot of times they're owned by the oligarchs themselves. So we have a system, sort of very oligarchic system right now, where each individual interests are being represented in a certain formulation of foreign policy, social economic agenda, as well as the degree of formulating of what the public consciousness, aka propaganda, what's being considered most important as far as the life of the everyday Americans is concerned. You also have to understand that when it comes to the American political rivalry, let's say every 4 years when you have elections, there's a lot of superficial conversation that's taking place that's supposed to galvanize people's emotions rather than any kind of policy aspects to, let's say, uh, candidate A, B, or C is going to come to the podium. So there's a lot of superficial conversation about pushing the emotional buttons and basically getting a score point over the political opponent. But when push comes to shove, and I give you an example of immigration, what Trump wants to do, you would have to have a at least 1.5 million people task force, should include not only law enforcement, but parts of the military, to get everybody booked out. First of all, located, investigated, and basically put on the bus or in the port. It's just we don't really have a manpower to even achieve this.
Okay, so you've traced the current political paradigm or the current paradigm in US politics, I should say, back to the Clinton era, highlighting how personal branding and performative actions, performative aspects, and the influence of campaign financing have shaped the political landscape. Uh, could you elaborate on how these factors, such as the portrayal of presidents as relatable figures, the role of special interest in funding in campaigns and sidelining uh, candidates seemingly standing out at the time when they were running, like Bernie Sanders, have contributed to this uh, the- theatric aspect of the political environment, or making it more theatrical.
But unfortunately, most of our population is economically and politically illiterate. They do not understand not only domestic political mechanisms, but also international as well. So anything that sounds great as a soundbite, in reality, is not complete practical nonsense. Because, and also what I think is really problematic in a idea of deportation that nobody brings up, that also automatically comes to the class issue. For example, if I'm the migrant which has some kind of money, I will be able to hire an immigration attorney and say, "Wait a second, I think I've done nothing wrong. And yes, maybe I entered the country illegally, but there has to be probable cause beyond just the illegal entry to have somebody deported in this case." So whoever has got money is able to engage the process, which right now people who are which also is just really not understood about our immigration process. Right now, every migrant that comes across the U.S. and claims the political asylum, they're entitled by law, by federal law, to due process, which means people have to go in front of an immigration judge to basically determine if the case itself has a standing, why they here, what reason they came for, and this has to go through the immigration court. Right now, people who are entering, let's say last month, people are getting dates in court at 2029, 2030. So you're talking about space of 4 or 5 years that people have legally, and they have to fend for themselves. But there's also no simple understanding that we all humans, we need to do something to survive, and there's no another avenue. Which, for example, in the European Union, to a large degree, when migrants come into EU, they get some kind of work permit or some temporary work permit that people can actually look for gainful employment. It's not so in the United States. So there's just complete this divorce of reality of our immigration system versus the idea how the system is supposed to work. So that itself creates degree of dissonance, cognitive dissonance among the population, where it's very easy to point a finger at someone else to blame them for decisions without really understanding the whole mechanism that drove person to make the decision one way or the other. And this is a fundamental problem here, which our media, our education system does not explain how the internal policies, how internal domestic and international parts of our government actually work. Nobody has an idea. I think this current paradigm of our politics, I think it can be traced to the Clinton era, where the Clintons came on the political stage. Um, uh, they both came from a very both Clintons, both Hillary and Bill, came from a sort of a lower echelon of our society, where um, this was a degree of I don't know social mobility, where Bill itself came from a single mother, broken family, father was alcoholic. Hillary came from middle class. Actually, Hillary went to the same high school that I was. I graduated from the same high school, only I think 15 years difference. So Hillary is a pretty fairly, yes, in the suburb of Chicago, Park Ridge. So there's a lot of rather uh, rather not a very positive uh, things that come out of the social upbringing of the Hillary. Uh, just judging from the professors and people that I talked to about, who know her, who knew her family. I'm not going to delve into deeper because it would just be hearsay, basically. But fundamental issue is that our political classes have decided to be sort of have a much more of a representative qualities of how to say this social standing versus relation to the each individual American voter versus a degree of political significance and power center. For example, the idea of and W. Bush has pioneered this idea of president that you would like to have a beer with, this everyday Joe type of six pack kind of guy. That actually came uh, as a enhancement of the popular image of the president, somebody that you can actually relate to on a personal level. And this came with Clinton's and Bush. Obama was a little bit different because he came from academia, so he was portrayed as some kind of like a bridge maker between different races. Because according to our political hype, we were supposed to bridge our racial differences with Obama. So there was a sort of a different field of experiences as far as the American voter is concerned. The problem is with our political system that the more imperial it gets, it's become sort of like a Byzantine like environment with courtiers, with different political influences. And Michael J. Glennon really clearly explains it very well in his book that specifies a variety of different competing interests that split even political interests when it comes when a party is concerned, the degree of galvanization to a person and a level of the president that's being respected, that's being introduced and introduced to the world and the American public, versus the real political interests which are hidden behind the scenes and actually making all the major political decisions. And also, one thing which is really, I think a lot of people from outside of the United States do not understand, the qualities of our politics are very much performative, most like a theater in a way. It's really there's a lot of chutzpah and a lot of different like performative qualities of art versus the real substance. So um, if you look at the real position of power, who makes what decisions, you have to look at the, for example, campaign donations. Where it's APAC that right now I think, as far as if I'm not mistaken, put almost $6 million into Kamala Harris camp versus Trump, which I think he got 3.5. I think at this point right now. So you have to look where the money is coming from to fund each individual campaign to see who's really standing behind certain economic interests and who are real decision makers. It's got to the point where, for example, people who are not able to compete within a certain perceived group of special interests, like, for example, on the left, Bernie Sanders, they're being automatically sidelined. They're being told, look, if you come to the power, you're going to get a visit, let's say, from few people in suits who have, let's say, week or 2 weeks within administration. They're going to come to the Oval Office, and they explain the reality of running our country. I give you a secret because I spoke with some people with the Trump administration uh, electoral project back in 2016 when I covered the electoral process for Belgian media at the time. Is that ironically or not, believe it or not, the Trump campaign itself was not a presidential campaign; it was actually a marketing campaign for his brand, which used the political process to. So when he won, he was as surprised as anybody else. None of the people who were hired in position of let's say in his team had any kind of international experience except of General Flynn, for example. They're completely and utterly unprepared for any kind of major job of the government because the his electoral team, what this was not about winning the elections. It was specifically to galvanize his brand, to basically to make money. That's all there was. That obviously started the whole movement blaming the Russiagate, Russians for everything, which all turned out to be completely false. But this was basically a situation to sort of I think to a lot of times our political processes are designed not to address the issues which affect major population group within the United States, but it's to sort of present the image that something's being done to sort of divert the attention of the public. And I think Americans are now waking up to the prospect rather cynically, where it doesn't really matter who gets in the power. The show will continue, and it's like a performance show. It really has no any kind of credible degree of initiative to really solve problems in this country. That's why one of the reasons our electoral attendance to our federal, let's say, local elections are historically low. I think. Last election was about 37, 38% of people who actually voted for to participate in the elections. One thing I think what most Europeans do not understand about political environment here, Americans generally are not political. We are not a political nation to the degree of quote unquote having fights over political affiliations, political ideas. This used to be a case back in the 19th century, but I think since 1930s or so, uh, this kind of degree of political activism activity is kind of weighing down as a wage of consumerism and prosperity. Historically, if you look at the politically involved class in our country, you see at some point sometimes somewhere between 5 and 7% of population that gets ultimately very active. However, the social media and the media exponentially increases this image because of the power of its media inertia to make it like a major serious point of a quote unquote incredible significance. And I used to report it from the European media in about US matters, and people are often very surprised. Are you sure this is, that there's no civil war between, let's say, Trump supporters and Kamala supporters? Certain aspects of our political class to galvanize and concentrate itself on this interpersonal crisis and conflict between several different groups of political activists to kind of deflect from major issues which are affecting the country that nobody talks about. So that's number one thing. And number two is that the number overall, we are a population of 340 million people. So overall number of people who are actively involved in the politics to the point, let's say, spending the time, spending their effort and lives into propagating a certain political idea, either left or right, is extremely insignificant. Majority of Americans are really hardworking people. People work 45, 50, 60-hour weeks. They don't have wherewithal or even time to get themselves involved to any kind of understanding of the political issues, not to mention a political, aspects of foreign policy, aspect of domestic policy. So that's the unfortunate reality in this country. So, in other words, either people who are involved intimately, ultimately, and intimately into the political, let's say, machinations of our country, are either wealthy, have time on their hands, or have a political stake or economic stake in the outcome. Majority of the population is not like this. So, sort of like this particular idea of creation of conflict it has something to do with the bread and circuses, which we have had for many, many generations here in this country. But ultimately, the outcome is very predictable and it's also very easily to be managed to the point where, yes, okay, Democratic Party wins over the Republicans, and there's vice versa. So, looking at the social media interactions between people and degree of manufactured conflict at this point, it's also very misgiving because it kind of gives amplification of the different ideas to the very small part of population. And generally, if you, if, for example, I give you an idea. For example, I spent a lot of time back 2016 election. Went to Iowa, went to uh, so-called Trump land, let's say Nebraska, Kansas, to really understand exactly what galvanizes people to vote for Trump. And what I found out incredibly is that, speaking on the individual level, is that it's not necessarily that people find Trump idea to be extremely evocative, presenting any kind of degree of coherent version of the reality which they want to vote for. Majority of the votes for Trump are made out of anger because they want to vote anti-system. So it doesn't really matter what Trump really brings to the table as far as the idea of political, cohesive idea of political aspects of let's say solution of the problems or economic, what have you. They basically want to give a finger to the system. And if there was, and one thing I was amazed to hear, people had at that time, Trump obviously was portrayed as a far right candidate, had a very positive opinion of Bernie Sanders, which there was almost no animosity whatsoever towards the left side, because everybody who was somewhat informed about American domestic policies knew that Bernie was a democratic socialist. First and foremost, what people liked about Bernie is he was not corrupt. So whatever, so whoever, if Bernie would get this ascendance to the same level as Trump was, people would have voted for him. I think even people on the right would have voted for him. That's one of the reasons that we are not very much politically driven by ideology. Yes, certain part of the population is, but majority of people, especially in the big cities, simply want to live and let live. And it's like this 4 year cycle of this performative art that comes to our cities. It's sort of it's galvanizing them for all the good and bad reasons.
Okay, so you've traced the current political paradigm or the current paradigm in US politics, I should say, back to the Clinton era, highlighting how personal branding and performative actions, performative aspects, and the influence of campaign financing have shaped the political landscape. Could you elaborate on how these factors, such as the portrayal of presidents as relatable figures, the role of special interest in funding and campaigns and sidelining uh, candidates seemingly standing out at the time when they were running, like Bernie Sanders, have contributed to this theatric aspect of the political environment or making it more theatrical.
We are a de facto empire in decline, and then nobody can deny this. Our infrastructure is going bad. Our schools are going bad towards every year. We have enclaves of societal development, which is very profitable, which is very well taken care of. Plus, we have a huge uh, sways of our hinterland, rural areas and also inner cities, which are absolutely going back like into 19th century right now, with the major problems as far as infrastructure is concerned. Nobody is addressing those issues. We have a food deserts in many cities where certain aspects of our urban landscape is not even served by the supermarket, for example. We have to drive go 6 7 miles to even go shopping, for example. We A lot of times people cannot even afford a car, for example. So it's so we have huge disparity, which is actually not being addressed by any kind of political party. I think Trump is generally perceived, and when looking at optics of our political system, as bad for business. And also, it is my personal, I was thinking quite a lot about this as well when I was reporting from the electoral. 2020, both Trump and Biden came to U.S. Midwest. I was at that time reporting for German media, where there was a basically in Kenosha we have a huge riots here. What happens is racial riots, basically, which wind up with one teenager taking AR-15 and shooting two people. There was a big hoopla over this as well, which is a part of the outcome of our political process. Uh, to think of it, it is my personal theory, looking at the situation, that we as society are not evolving. We actually are devolving ourselves into the very much like an adolescent high school mentality where if I don't like somebody, I hate them with all my guts. Doesn't matter. And it's absolutely absurd to I think to look at this from a kind of sober, adult point of view, because it doesn't make any sense. If you look at a political platform, either candidate, you should generally, as a person, analyze good sides and bad sides, good points versus bad points. What is it good for me? What Trump has brought in is its new quality of the American populism that tends to thrive purely on emotions. If I hate this guy's guts, I'm going to hate him with all my heart, regardless if I lose, basically, if I burn my own house, if I lose everything I own, but as long as I get Trump. But, this is not a new phenomenon in American politics. In somewhere, as a historian, as a part-time historian of the American politics, this reminds me of the era of the running early 19th century of 1825, 1826 tenure of Andrew Jackson, who's our general, who apparently won major battle of war of 1812 against the British and Battle of New Orleans, who then became a major anti-hero to the American political establishment by, for example, fighting the United States Bank of the United States, which he actually won, which was a precursor to our Federal Reserve, what was trying to be established at the time, and also the guy of incredible genocide of bringing all the Native Americans behind the west of Mississippi, the so-called Trail of Tears, where basically we had a death march of our native population from the East Coast, basically behind the Mississippi to Neverland, where people were simply was like a death march from Auschwitz in 1945 to put equivalent. And he brought exactly the same kind of degree of emotions, raw emotions. If you read the early American press, it's almost this degree of hate, because he Jackson represented this sort of buccaneering, anti-establishment, anti-corporate, increasing corporate, idea of control from the East Coast, from the powers of Philadelphia, Boston, and New York, which were then considered sort of a treasonous to the American buccaneering spirit of going west, taking the land, developing the country. So this is sort of like harks on the nerve that actually maybe was always there within our public, within our psyche, but lay dormant for many generations, and it kind of miraculously was resurrected with the idea of Trump. And I think a lot of similarities I see it from that point of view. Uh, but it is a form of devolution. But I think this comes, to really truly analyze it. We should really look at the structure of American society. Who actually are we, as far as the national zeitgeist? Our population has only 39% of population in the United States has passports. For example, we never travel anywhere outside of the US, and most of the passports holders just travel to Mexico and Canada, which are our neighbors, which are somewhat similar economically and politically, what have you. So, talking to Americans about, let's say, political aspects of the societies in Europe or in Asia, it's almost like talking to somebody, from Mars, try to explain the realities of everyday life because we don't have the knowledge. We are pumped. Yes, to a certain degree, yes, because our society has always been a very much a people don't realize it's always been a project of the class environment more than any kind of degree of national identity. Of course, in our civics, in our high schools and colleges, we always try to portray ourselves as a nation of immigrants. People go west, go out there, make a living for yourself. Anybody can make it. To a certain degree, it is true. However, there's a very invisible line of class within our society itself, and I think the Brits are much more honest about it because of the racial slash class line nowadays is much clearly defined in Britain, for example, which is similar to our society for many different respects. But it's that people should not be able to cross it because there will be consequences. What happens in the United States, we have the same thing as well. However, it's not clearly defined. It's not clearly written. However, when you cross it, you will find out with the very negative consequences. So it's a very different kind of environment where the political perception has always been dominated by where one sits in lives by idea of class more than anything else, because the class also means proper education, what is considered proper, which means most likely Ivy League school, usually a private school, private high school. There's degree of even the way we, for example, live in our everyday life. With the COVID, food became an incredible class issue. If you want to eat well, you go to places like Whole Foods, which is now owned by Amazon, which actually a lot of people, you know, uh, degradingly call it whole paycheck because the food is so expensive. You literally pay $8 or $9 for one loaf of bread, and these are the people from upper class or manager class can afford those type of prices. Majority of people who are lower economic status go to Aldi or they go to fast eat fast food as a food experience. A class divide on an incredible different level that kind of pretty much comes across the where places where we live, like zip codes, for example. We call it zip codes, the area where you live, the cars you drive, the schools your kids attend. So there's this degree of unwritten social conduct, social code, which automatically points you to a certain strata of social economic class, which and along with this, you're supposed to have a certain degree of formulated political worldview, what's beneficial for you, which means, you're supposed to act and vote accordingly to your social class interest. So there's really no any kind of like the whole Americans we all need together is complete myth. It's complete fake that fake idea that's been perpetuated from generations generations. Yes, there was a period of that maybe before World War II, where we had a huge economic dislocation caused by Great Depression, where there was a real chance of country turning communist. If it's ever was, FDR foresaw it, and therefore he implemented a lot of social economic reforms and changes, which kind of can, which he himself said, if I don't make those changes, we are going to have a country that's going to turn either fascist or communist. Most likely, communist would have been the case here. Uh, and that kind of dissipated with the World War II victory, and the rise of the American consumerism.
What you've described so far is the self-serving nature of politics and self-serving nature of politics in the United States, and I think many Eastern Europeans, might notice similarities between that, what you described here, and what's happening in their own countries. So, do you think we could dedicate a few minutes to discuss how personal agendas and internal conflicts and this focus on self-interest among political leaders, how internal class conflicts contribute to the dysfunction in the US political system? How does this shift toward a more personal enterprise reflect on the state of American politics today?
My personal impression is that there are certain elements of our American deep state who simply cannot stand them on a personal level. So they'll simply go to any extent. And as I said, this represents what I said earlier, sort of like a, you know, um, infantilization, or I don't know, just kind of juvenilization of our politics. But look at John Bolton, who was actually national security advisor, who was appointed by Trump. Trump hated him, but he was actually made to appoint him to be in charge of our, national security aspects of foreign policy. And there was incredible clash of personality between Bolton and Trump. At the one point, Bolton actually, I think, in one of the angry utterances, actually he even mentioned it with some journalists in with the media. I think CBS, if I remember correctly, that Trump should be taken care of, whatever that's supposed to mean. So, so there's this personal animosity, but I think also another impression I've heard from my context of Washington. When Trump was elected, he basically became sort of like a pirate ship of all the different freaks and opportunists that came along with him, piggyback on his success, and everybody was pretty much interested in their personal agendas, whether it's economic, mostly economic, and everything else. So there was a good degree of dysfunction where people were stumbling over each other to get their own prerogatives, without complete misunderstanding how the U.S. government works, specifically on the legislative and executive branch levels. So this was just a lot of sort of like it became sort of like a circle firing squad of personal vanities, which came into place. We have, but I think the same can be actually said about Kamala Harris environments as well. To what I've heard, there was a poll. Someone actually informed me about last week. We had a conversation about this with another journalist out of California, who told me in past 5 years, her staff retention was like 95%, 94% of people who worked for her quit. So obviously, there's some kind of degree of toxicity, and also lack of coherent vision on her own camp. There's so many people would quit within a very short, 5 years is a very short period of time, when she was governor of California, for example. I'm sorry, Attorney General of California. So, in other words, this our American political project is becoming sort of like a personal enterprise entrepreneurship type of project where, yeah, I can go to work for the public service, but in actuality, it's all about self service, whatever you can get for yourself, which I think is quite similar in Polish politics or Eastern European politics to what I see what's going on in Eastern Europe. That's why you have this type of degree of perversity or cartoonesque type of the grotesqueness, like Trump appointed Ambassador Mosbacher. She would literally go to the different ministries in Poland, for example, to demand certain favors or certain decisions being made. I even asked at one point, when I was reporting for the Belgians, I even asked embassy in Warsaw whether Ambassador Mosbacher is actually representing the United States or she's representing her corporate clients. because I really kind of want to understand exactly if she's going on behalf, let's say, of Roche Pharmaceutical, which happen to be Swiss, her presence lobbying on the behalf of a Swiss corporation, how is it actually working out within our pay scale? Are we taxpayers subsidizing her activities as a lobbyist for a pharmaceutical company, or she's paying for her trip or her contacts of her own pocket? How does it really work? Obviously, I've received no answers from our Department of State, but it's this type of degree of micromanagement or petty way of doing business, it's truly unheard of. It's something maybe from 19th century Poland, when Poland was part of the Russian Empire or so. And
Many Americans seem to hold nostalgic views of past eras, with conservatives often pointing to the 1950s before the social and cultural revolutions, and those on the progressive side idealizing the times of FDR and his New Deal policies. How do these differing perspectives on America's golden age influence the current political discourse? Is there, in your opinion, any merit um, to the idea that America was truly great, in these past periods?
most people would say, on a conservative side, the idea is always about 1960s, where the sexual revolution, the hippie revolution in 1960s, where we lost our first major war, which is a Vietnam War. And from that conservative side, right wing would say this is when things start going down. On the left, the idea would be basically going back towards the FDR, because the FDR is considered the golden age of the American politics, where there was certain degree of socialistic policies, and so people always kind of look at this holy grail, like I think you know I think I think what Trump really did, I think, was quite great, and from image standpoint, it was this stupid slogan, "Make America Great Again," which actually somebody else used it before. In the 50s, I'm not sure. There was another politician, Republican, I think, that actually used it before. So it is not the original feeling. But the thing is, "Make America Great Again," was it really that great? That's the number one thing. Um, because it all depends where you sit within a society. What you do for a living, how much money you make, what kind of successful personal life you have with friends, with the family, what have you. So it's a very subjective thing. And I think we are always kind of driven to this ideal. It's like we can always do better than we are. And but I think the majority of people who are making this type of argument, they don't really know the history very well, or point of reference, or have any kind of degree of empathy to other social groups, economic groups, social economic groups, that were actually on the receiving end of the bad policies, we, for which for whom the life was not really great to begin with. Well, we just kind of can tend to forget that, yes, our standard of living is actually in the since 1990 is actually visibly is going down because of the inflationary pressures, economic pressures. We are pretty much all as a society deindustrialized now. That's right, Goldwater. That's what I was referring to. Yep, the Goldwater. Yeah. So it's not the original. So there's actually not a. It's basically, you know, uh, refried steak, basically from 30, 40 years ago. Because the idea is just, you know, we have a very short memory, to the degree where we always try to kind of portray ourselves as a society, as an initial zeitgeist, to be better than we are. And I think also we live in this world make believe, which is very much a determinist by, I think, Calvinism, which, our society has always been founded as a quote unquote Protestant colony. And after so many hundreds of years, it still comes out, believe it or not. So, I think it's really interesting to see this kind of like determinist, Calvinist slash, you know, some elements of Zwingli, if you talk about theology, are still coming out within our society. This very kind of Protestant myth of self-made, or you're predestined to be great. Predestination, I think, is really important here. Well, that's the American spin it comes in, that actually we have to be number one. And I think the lowest common denominator of self feeling is that even if you come out of the deal with you don't have a pants on because you've been ripped off, you feel like $1 million. So it's about the feeling, it's about internal projection. For example, when I was reporting from American Heartland in Kansas, and one thing, for example, what amazed me is that I think we obviously on the right at least there is a some kind of recognizance of about national debt. So I've asked this question. Well, what about raising the taxes on corporations and the rich? Well, the response was, "No, I'm against it because one day I'll be rich." And you can have it. It really you can't make this stuff up. I mean, and often the people who have really not a penny to their name live in dilapidated housing and really good art district, school districts have driven broken down cars, but they still would recite this degree of programming in a way. You know, it kind of makes you wonder if our society is not really managed by some kind of governmental psyop in a way, where the programming comes so early from the early age, also comes from a religious side as well, to tell us how great we really are. But I think it only works in societies that don't happen to travel a lot.
How do you perceive the impact of American foreign and economic policies, around abroad, but also domestically? And elaborate a little bit on the systemic issues that contribute to what you describe as a really poor society. Is it just many Americans living paycheck to paycheck, financial instability, lack of social safety network, vacation time very limited, and so on and so forth? Or is there anything more to it?
I see it from my vantage point since I lived in three different continents and five different countries in my life, and I spend a lot of time in Europe now for personal reasons. So I see the effects of the American foreign policy and economic policy, our corporations ever expanding and ripping people off in other countries as well. But I think our system is designed specifically this way, where we have first of all we have no vacation. If you get any kind of job, beyond being a teacher, for example, you get 10 days or 14 days of vacation per year. That's it. And after maybe 10 years, you get a third week, if that much. Plus, we live paycheck to paycheck, with cost is being incredibly increasing every time. What most people don't realize, 62% of Americans don't have more than $1,000 in the bank. So we are generally a really, really poor society. We don't have money. Everything we earn, so we are one major catastrophe like car breaking down or a health issue if you don't have an insurance. You literally can be on the street within a month or two, because we don't really have a social contract like a lot of European countries have, where okay, you pay high taxes, this and that, but education is free, medical healthcare is free. This is what we can provide for you just to be a good citizen. We don't really have that. Our mentality is basically go out there and kill what you eat, which is kind of very primeval, and kind of harks back, but it kind of harks back to the our national psyche to being a settler society, back in 17th century, where the country is being kind of colonized, and where we kill the locals, kill the natives, and just went out there and brought a lot of immigrants in to kind of settle the matter. So it's like, so this zeitgeist kind of still exists in this certain way. You go across the border to Canada, it is completely different makeup. It's much more European. I think they matured enough to the point where, but on the other hand, that they have to provide some kind of social construct. But on the other hand, they have a very small population. They have barely 40 million people. We have 340. So any kind of social experiment that actually winds up taking care of people on a more systemic issue has to be also conducted in a way where you take the population and numbers and varieties that go along with it to make it workable. I think in the US, this just generally would not work. As a negative, I'm really negative on this. Since I covered American politics, what I was used to write for the think tank in Washington, is that, for example, a lot of times legally, local regulations we pitted against the federal regulations, and federal regulations against the state regulations, just to create this conflict where somebody else can benefit from this. You know, so there's not a kind of, we are not at this monolith. Like, I understand it's very difficult for Europeans to understand we are an empire, but we are actually, if you really look at our society, we are very incoherent empire. But it's all different power centers. When the wartime is different, because like World War II, where the federal government has really taken over basic management of the economy. We have a central planned economy, the World War II, for example, to defeat the Nazis and Japanese. So it's not always been like this. But generally, it's only in times of crisis where everything comes together. And this was the feeling I had. Um, right after September 11, 2001, where pretty much everybody politically took out their differences aside. People were quieter, much more towards collaborative mode. But there was, on the negative side, there was absolutely no dissent allowed. So none whatsoever. So it was really it was. This is the first time I saw my country in this type of mode for about 2 months or so. That it's scary.
But I wonder, is it not like history is repeating itself now with Ukraine and with how you have to basically discuss Russia as another incarnation of the Third Reich and Putin another Hitler and everything?
There's anger within American society about this, but it's basically misplaced anger because it's monetary. It's about the cost of the war, which we're supposed to be funding. What people don't understand the basic knowledge how the military conflict in Ukraine is being fought. First of all the money that's appropriated to the war in Ukraine stays in the U.S. 95% of money goes to local contractors, so money actually never leaves America. So that's the number one thing. Number two, the issue is majority of money just being Ukraine is being given as a form of a loan. That's the reason Ukraine now is basically a neoliberal hell now, where you can really literally buy everything pennies on the dollar. And basically, it's sort of like a social economic experiment where everybody looks at a war situation, nobody looks internally what's going on within Ukraine. And that's a really huge story.
What I wanted to ask is whether now the level of the prohibition of dissent is similar to what you experienced after 9/11 with regards to Russia.
Not even close. First of all, we were attacked. Therefore, we had a physical, war damage on our territory, and it's a big difference because people are now losing their loved ones, and you don't have those images of towers burning. Because the idea was this was the war where, right away, our political establishment took advantage of it and basically directed the whole ire of our military towards the Middle East. Like this was the really in Afghanistan, which was the culprit, which is actually not true. But this is how this whole energy was really channeled into this. So number one thing, we were not attacked. So there's a different vibe because of that alone. Second of all, there's anger about misappropriation of the. For example, if you ask regular American, regardless of socioeconomic divide or Republican Democrat divide, why they're against, majority of Americans are against the funding war in Ukraine, because they reflect is, look at our communities, look at our bridges, look at our infrastructure. Why there's no money available for our local needs, specifically when we have a huge austerity program being thrown down our throats, where taxes are being increased and inflation for basic stuff is going up, but there is money for corporations for war in Ukraine, not necessarily for corporations, because people do not understand this mechanism that well. That basically all the money that's being transferred to war in Ukraine winds up going into the pocketbooks of the military industrial complex, which basically people who want to play the market game with the stock market, they will benefit from this, which is basically very small sliver of our society. So there's all interconnected, but people don't really look at it this way. They say why there's money for them, but there's not money for us. Then this is really lowest common denominator of anger that comes through, and which is quite justifiable, because you would say, well, I pay high taxes and taxes are increasing, and instead get better quality of care, let's say at our schools or our very limited medical health system. Actually, things are getting worse, from bad to worse every year, and the money's kind of disappearing, and everybody's burning, carrying the burden. Only if you watch the CBS News or NBC or CNN, and also read the neoliberal magazines, like newspapers like Washington Post, New York Times. They're proclaimed that things couldn't be better. I mean, the economy is doing great. For the top earners, things have always been great, always been great. So there's a disconnect of reality, and this is where Trump comes in, because he basically states, well, it's your fault, and I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But factually, Trump is the same part of the mechanism that created this whole freaking problem. So it's in a way, he's a demagogue that's able to kind of channel the anger into the electoral points. But at the end of the day, he's just the same, part of a cognitive little political machine that, like, the other side is. There's really no difference in a way.
Many Eastern Europeans might wonder why the US political system seems or is so resistant to meaningful reform. despite it allegedly being a democracy. So, could you explain the rigidity of the political structure in the US?
I generally looking at a structure and how our system has evolved over the years, I'm rather pessimistic about any kind of degree of rigidity, you can call it, to the degree where our system has, on one hand, been so calcified into the very rigid political structure, doesn't allow any kind of degree of political reform within itself. This is basically predestined on the position of money that plays a role in our, but also plays role in the characters and people who are being elected into the office coming to environment. First and foremost, emphasizes a self-interest, not a public interest. And these are often people who not only just come from a lot of times they come from the capitalist class, economic accomplishment phrase society, and then they simply want to go to the so-called to kind of rebuild the life or rebuild life for everyone else from their own vantage point. If they're successful, their point of view is basically, oh, let's just make everyone the same way I got rich or got successful in a way. Unfortunately, in a complex society such as in the United States, with variety of political factions, but also a really complicated society, it will not work. Um, you know, I was thinking today actually because uh, our decay preoccupied on simply not only on a national grandeur, where there's a lot of patriotism, flag waving, never-ending imperial wars, but also first and foremost on individual standard of living of who lives in this country, pays taxes, send their kids to school, what have you. And I think started at the end of the Reagan era and 80s and in till now, Americans have got accustomed to idea where kids coming from the next generation will be worse off, will not have so many opportunities like they themselves have. And this is really kind of pessimism that kind of characterize our everyday life, propaganda, hoopla, flag waving, number one, and all the stuff. It's an innate understanding that our system's working not for us, and that's one of the reasons it gives rise to populist Trumpism that we have seen are kind of resigned to, but at least in regards of the Trump ascendancy, they're able to give a finger to the system still because the Americans who live in who are just regular people like do not benefit from the system. You have to go a degree of socioeconomic strata, let's say corporate class or higher government class, in order to actually get tangible benefits from it. What difference does it make for American government wants to basically overturn their elections in Venezuela right now with Maduro? For me, as a regular person, it doesn't make an iota of difference whatsoever. But it makes difference for political donor class, let's say from our petrochemical industry complex. So these are tangible benefits which our PAC Americana setup kind of derives for upper echelons of our society, not only the middle class, but also people who, let's say, invested money in the stock market, who are able to benefit from the, from so-called capitalist largesse of the, play, for example, by up every year, and they actually get dividends of this. So there's a sliver of society, I would say 15, 20%, more like 20%, that actually benefits while leaving 80% of people behind. And these are the dynamics. Instead of the political class, the upper political classes are very well versed in the art of manipulating the public opinion to the degree where at the end of the day, they have to keep the 8% that are being left behind by the system, entertained and feel good mode, and make sure if you work hard enough, eventually the wealth will come to you and you'll be just fine. So this is basically the dynamics of dream, which first of all, people, in order to have a dream, you have to be asleep first. So, in a way, our system is sort of self-perpetuating in its own genius, in order of life, which is not necessarily real, but it's feels like a real for someone who hasn't traveled anywhere, who has never been anywhere, who's only, let's say, mass media for self-propagandizing effort of self-assurance or what have you. And unfortunately, what is a huge, enormous problem of drugs, alcohol, and variety of different other vices is that anything that is systemic, it's always brought to a denominator. For example, if you're not rich, you haven't been successful in many different aspects of life, it's your individual fault. Don't yourself. What you have done to yourself? It's your own fault. Kind of insidious, extremely perverse system of like a feedback loop, where their lowest common denominator actually played in order to actually keep a self-check mode. Political system in this country will not any results of fixing problems. The system is not designed to fix any problems. It's simply designed to protect the status quo. That's all that matters. And you as an informed person, you have to look exactly who's benefiting from, to think exactly that the same protagonists played role in American politics, also played role in many different countries, and often those protagonists are backed up by people from, let's say, a group or World Economic Forum. These are protagonists that kind of go annual meetings. Basically, they kind of decide. Actually, it's an official body to decide, official, I would say, governmental policies pretty much everywhere now. Is really becoming a huge problem. So yes, my answer question would be that the system, it eventually will have to collapse.
Provided the ethnic diversity in the United States and the feelings among at least some groups of becoming minorities in their own country or in their own region, how do you think that impacts the potential for a unified or any kind of viable resistance against the established political system?
I would say no, for several different reasons. First of all, our societies become much more biased, if I use this word. We are much more ethnic oriented. Like, let's say, countries increasingly Latino and Spanish, basically almost on the same level like Canada, being almost in a parity right now. I speak Spanish fluently, so for me it's not a problem. For Anglos, it would be a problem because they feel in certain areas like big minorities in their own country, which is something similar to what cities like Brussels or or Berlin, some places, what have you. So that's one thing. Second of all, resistance or any kind of to this, it's coming from the right, mostly from the American faith community, evangelical community, or what have you. So I think this is automatically alien, because on the way you can join up, let's have a cross societal, cross ethnic league of the resistance versus our quote unquote established try to galvanize in the first factual process, coined slogan, let's drain the swamp, right? But it's the problem is that he's a swamp creature himself, considering his own previous life system. He sort of became part of the system. And second of all, if the right is going to be cohesive them to fight the corruption in Washington, does it have to offer go back to like 18th system of Judeo-Christian values, which in a way also harked back to the degree of pioneer life and settler mentality. At that time, harked back to the genocide of the native population. I can use the slogan. It's not necessarily a great remedy. Our system will eventually work. Is that since our variety of different um, political groups, which all have grouping regional politics in the United States, the most likely scenario where the country will eventually break up in several different parts, and then they will basically have the kind of like commonality within a certain region, a political ecosystem to say, like for example, first time ever the modern time in Texas, since last summer, the Texas legislature occasional hearings on Texas independence, and several different protagonists within this political establishment has actually, in case things are so bad in Washington they don't listen to us, we are wealthy enough, our social economic ecosystem is strong enough to declare independence. Let's go back to the independence and create our own country, for example, and forget what's going on in part of the country. To this way, if our federal system would become perhaps weak and our military step in, because at the end of the day, I find it hard to believe that we would sit back as a society, it is in the computer screens, and things kind of dissolve, decay to the level where there be chaos and nothing. Eventually, there will always be a tipping. Military will step in, and military, despite so many different problems, or war, everything else, is still made up of people who are coming from lower and middle classes. Therefore, there is a degree of respect for the where there actually isn't in any other part of the American government. I mean, I think the Congress right now has approval rating of about 6% of the whole population, not 6%. So military has still a degree of respectability and degree of trust. Where things go really south, military would be willing to step in. And I think one of the reasons that a lot of people are from the right and seeing the rules movement coming from the right are looking at this as, with the January 6th, they're seeing as sort of like one of the small tremors of the bureaucratic coming up in the future, where eventually we'll become rise to the point where military would take over, and actually this particular move, which effectively would democracy, but this move would definitely be up, because as I said earlier, most Americans want peace, most Americans predictable life. They do not want to live in a society where there's up and down turmoil and there's no safety. There's gun battles. American debt is not priced in dollars. The oil is priced. So as long as all the oil trade goes with the through the U.S. dollar system, therefore there will be a demand overseas to keep it being recycled. However, if let's say BRICS or any other political rivals would develop their own currency, they're able to actually develop their own homogeneity to settle the accounts and trade internationally. This would be the day one of the real factual American imperial decline, because all the U.S. money that's been abroad is going to be coming back to the U.S. and it's going to be an incredible degree of devaluation that's going to make pain was back in 2002, which I covered in Buenos Aires in Argentina. Look at child play. The American money would become worthless basically overnight. So this is exactly the game that's being played right now, where ourselves ahead of the game as much as possible, looking in the near future. But that said, like you so rightly said, the British Empire kind of wind themselves down with our help. This time around, this might not be the same case. Happening, I've noticed in our very, I would say, selfish and self-centered way of doing business, that we are putting the countries on peripheries of our economic Union, Ukraine, and let's say Taiwan or Japan and South Korea, and into much larger economic peril than our alliances or our allies in order to keep ourselves ahead. And this is one of the reasons I really simply understand from geopolitical standpoint. So this is a fundamental problem, I think, in our geopolitical thinking, that de facto think that we own Western Europe, we own countries that are our allies, and we basically tell them, everybody has to get with the program or else. Nobody really wants to find out what it means. And this is a perpetuating of I don't know of self-destruction in a way where Europe has it much worse than we ever have. For example, because comes the worst, we have all the resources that we need to survive itself. We have oil, we have gas, we can able in food production. The worst comes the worst if there's a, let's say, geopolitical crisis that basically is going to sever all the international trade links. Sure, it will be tough on us. We will survive. I don't think I can say the same thing about your million plus inhabitants, where pretty much you guys are really on the risk on other outside region for pretty much anything they. So I think this is a completely different vantage point that we can look at problems. Something that I think uh, European political elites are not really deeply, specifically with the cleavage to Ukraine, which happens with the Visegrad group, with Slovakia and Hungary, much more sober assessment of the situation between two different blocs in order their advantageous position for themselves politically and economically, versus everybody else just playing the game with the in long term, in on the front line of the if that happens. And this imperial era has a very profound evangelical pioneer, I would say, pilgrim in world established new world order at the time, and pushing out kids and setting up the kind of work for itself. There is this conditioning also the educational system that America can simply do not do any wrong, and we are the heroes. We always it's got to be blamed. Our political system or our educational system rise from it doesn't teach reality of life. They teach sort of like things how they think be, but not how they really are. And any time for, let's say, our setup university process, college or even high school level, you're a organization from the political that says, well, political class, you're biased or you're honest or you're this and that, it's just sort of like a norm in a way. So there's always like a degree of criticism coming from the political class itself, has done really well for itself. So the way we look at the foreign countries, and let's say in particular, really friendly fascism, you can probably call it that way, where yes, you'll be treated very well, very nicely with great photo op and so on, as long as you drink the Kool-Aid, get it with the game. If you do not going to get along with our political program or cause problems to our corporations, will report you to our political class for some cleanup. You're going to have a problem in let's say in the political process in your country, or like we do in the case of Venezuela, where we will actually appoint and decide elections. It's that absurd. That's why I think the system has to collapse first. Any kind of changes can be meaningfully made. I'm highly skeptical that system indeed evolve reforming itself. I don't think it is.
Okay, thank you very much, Derek. Thank you for your time, for your insights, for your observations, comments, opinions, and analysis. And to our viewers, listeners, and readers, please proceed to our Patreon page, patreon.com/thebarricade, where you can make either a one-off donation or create a monthly subscription if you like our productions. Thank you very much for supporting Eastern European independent media. See you again on the barricades soon.